president continuing to stand by a Supreme Court nominee as Brett Kavanaugh faces allegations of sexual assault when he was in high school. Tonight, it's not clear if his abuser, Christine Blasey Ford, will testify at a planned Senate hearing on Monday. Let's bring in our analyst, and Jeffrey Toobin, I'll turn to you first. The president was, again, uncharacteristically toned down during those comments he made earlier today. But one thing that stood out to me was he did say he felt sorry for Brett Kavanaugh. He could not use the name Christine Blasey Ford. And again, it seemed like a situation where the president stands with the accused and not the accuser. It just seems to be a pattern.
It's a pattern starting with himself, who is a multiply accused abuser of women. And, he said he felt sorry for Brett Kavanaugh here having to deal with the accusation and, of course, no sympathy for the alleged victim. But, the fact remains that if she doesn't show up on Monday, this confirmation is going through. And even though the Republicans have set up a structure that is very much rigged to help Brett Kavanaugh with no other witnesses, no other investigation, it's really a take it or leave it proposition for her, and we'll see if she takes it.
And Rebecca Berger, I mean, Jeffrey does make a good point, because if you're Christine Blasey Ford and what they're telling you is all you can have is a one-on-one sort of trial with Brett Kavanaugh, that may not sound as enticing as having supporting witnesses, as perhaps subpoenaing Mark Judge, the friend who was allegedly there at the time for this incident, and so on. Right. I suppose perhaps at this point it's not too surprising that we have not heard yet from Ford as to whether she's going to do this.
Right. I mean, this is a huge decision for any person to have to make, Jim, but especially when you consider that this woman is a private citizen who didn't necessarily want or invite all of this attention. She had what she felt was a very important piece of information that she wanted to share with the senators as they considered their decision, and now faces this choice of should she put herself in the national spotlight. And already, we've heard reports that she's had to leave her home, that she's staying elsewhere, that her kids are staying elsewhere, she's off of social media. The scrutiny and the pressure on someone who is, again, a private citizen, it's extremely intense. And you could see why she would take her time making this decision.
And David Swerdlig, I mean, she does potentially, be setting the stage to become sort of the next Anita Hill, who was the accuser during the Clarence Thomas saga. And Anita Hill did resurface to write something in the New York Times saying that the Senate Judiciary Committee still lacks a protocol for vetting sexual harassment and assault claims that surfaced during a confirmation hearing. Suggests that the committee has learned little from the Thomas hearing, much less than the more recent Me Too movement. Anita Hill has a point here in that, it seems that we have this archaic system for dealing with these sorts of accusations in a Supreme Court nomination process.
Yeah, I think Professor Hill is right that the Senate is ill-equipped in some ways to do this. I do think that she's also right that this could be a sort of a circus atmosphere that is not, as Rebecca was saying, particularly fair or charitable to a private citizen who, by all accounts, didn't want their name to be out there. Now that Dr. Ford's name is out there, and now that she's told her story to my Washington Post colleagues, now that this is heading toward this sort of, in theory, conclusion on Monday, I think it doesn't serve her interest not to tell her story, because the court of public opinion will judge her harshly if she now doesn't speak up and tell her story, even though she faces incredible consequences about this. I don't see how it's in her interest to stay silent at this point.
And there's a lot of pressure on Dr. Ford at this point, isn't there, Sam Vinograd?
There is, but this is an unfair set of choices for Dr. Ford. She either has to show up and testify on Monday, which is a very short amount of time to prepare for a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, or she won't show up and will know that her accuser will be appointed to the Supreme Court. So this is really a rigged system, as Anita Hill points out in her op-ed. And some things have changed since 1991. There is a heightened focus on sexual assault. The courts have had 17 more years to look at sexual assault cases and sexual harassment. But what hasn't changed is that the accuser is still being put on trial on Monday, if this goes forward, with no witnesses. and when the outcome almost seems predetermined. So while some conditions have changed since 1991, the forecast for anybody that comes forward with a sexual assault claim in this kind of process remains exactly the same.
And Jeffrey,
and
go ahead, Jeffrey.
Let's just focus on the absurdity of this process. There is a third person who is alleged to have been in the room, Mark Judge. In any rational fact-finding process, he would be called to testify. His lawyer sends a letter today, said, oh, he'd prefer not to testify. Well, that's very interesting, but there's something called a subpoena, that in a normal investigative procedure, he would be subpoenaed. The Republicans would say, well, it's very nice you don't want to testify, but we have subpoena power. Get in here and testify on Monday. But the Republicans in the Senate, they don't want him to testify. They don't want more evidence. They don't want a real investigation, so they're not going to subpoena him. It's just indicative of what a kangaroo court this is.
And David,
I just want to follow up on something that Sam said. I agree that it's not fair to Dr. Ford that the onus is being put on her here, but I don't think the onus is on her, Jim, to determine the fate of Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. I simply think the onus is on her now that she is out there in the public to tell the truth as she sees it or as she knows it. We're here, broadly speaking, with Judge Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court because there was an election in 2016, because President Trump is the president, because there's a Republican-controlled Congress, because in terms of the way this process has been handled, senators on both sides of the aisle have allowed this to become a circus-like atmosphere.
And guys, I want to play this piece of video that came in this afternoon. It shows Brett Kavanaugh back in 2015 talking about what happens at Georgetown Prep, staying at Georgetown Prep, but not a very helpful soundbite for him, but let's play it.
Fortunately, we had a good saying that we've held firm to this day, as the dean was reminding me before the talk, which is what happens at Georgetown Prep stays at Georgetown Prep. That's been a good thing for all of us, I think.
What do you make of that, Rebecca?
Well, obviously in that context, Jim, he was making a joke, and you
Right.
could see where that would be funny in a normal context. But now, of course, we're hearing that soundbite in a very different context. It makes him sound flippant. You could apply it to the current allegations against him. It sounds much more nefarious, but of course he didn't mean it like that.
Well, and how about Mark Judge? I mean, Mark Judge has written not one but two books about being a blackout alcoholic at Georgetown Prep at the time when, according to Ms. Blasey, the assault took place by two drunken students. I mean, it doesn't prove anything in and of itself, but it is circumstantial evidence that if you were doing an actual serious investigation, you would figure into the process.
Right.
And Samantha Vinograd, what do you think the president's team is doing right now as Christine Blasey Ford is trying to decide, what they should do? I mean, obviously what we saw from the president earlier today was, the president has been holding back somewhat. We've been talking about that over the last 24 hours, exactly for now. But he did sound like he was getting more aggressive in his posture, blaming this on Dianne Feinstein, saying that the Democrats, all they want to do is obstruct and resist. It sounds as if the White House, after being pushed back on their heels yesterday, is sort of getting their act together, getting their talking points together, and all the while, Brett Kavanaugh is going over to the White House and prepping for this hearing on Monday.
Exactly. I think the president's team is probably praying that the president doesn't tweet anything malicious against the accuser, because remember, when he's backed into a corner, typically his strategy is to try to malign the victim and try to malign the accuser, to say that they're lying. And in his comments today, he was restrained for now, and that's probably because maybe because he has a daughter, he has a wife. That hasn't stopped him before. So I think, Jim, it's probably just a matter of time before he says something about the character of Dr. Ford. And I think that it's just a waiting game.